Hi, this is Dr. Isom. I'm back to give you the second part of the lecture on research methods and personality. This part will cover personality research design, including things that you need to think about when you're collecting data using the 4 data types that were covered in the first part of this lecture, and those are the BLISS types: B for behavioral data, L for life outcome data, I for informant report data, and S for self-report data. Things that we need to think about are the reliability, validity, and generalizability of that data. The first thing to consider is reliability. And reliability, when we're measuring any sort of personality attribute, is the degree to which the measure we get is an accurate measure of that person's personality, and every time we use that measure, it gives you an accurate result. So whether or not the measure that you get represents the true level of the trait that you're measuring refers to that measure's reliability. Now, whether that measurement is actually measuring the trait that you're interested in measuring, that is something else. That is the validity of the instrument or measurement that you're using. It's important to be sure that the test that you're using, so let's say to measure anxiety, is truly a measure of anxiety. That is referring to the validity of the test. And then last, another thing to consider is the generalizability of the data that you're collecting and the results that you get. Generalizability refers to how well the results of a study can be applied to people in other settings at other times, etc. But there are also times when generalizability of your data is not the primary goal, and that's particularly true when you're studying personality differences across cultures. Let's go into more detail on reliability. Reliability, you can substitute the word accuracy for reliability, because what we are wanting to make sure when we're thinking about reliability is that we're getting an accurate measurement of whatever construct you're trying to measure. So it's the tendency of that measurement instrument or that test to give you the same information on different occasions. Now, the assumption is that whatever you're measuring, that quantity doesn't change. When you end up getting very different scores for the same measured construct on different occasions, and the assumption is that the construct is not really changing, then what you have is a measurement error or error variability problem. You're getting error variance in your measures. And error variance is just when you have external influences that are changing or making your measurement less accurate. This brings up this very important theory that you need to know. It's part of personality research, and that's classical test theory. And classical test theory essentially says that any score that you get of any measurement, whether it's a scale that measures weight or a personality test that measures, let's say, anxiety, the score that you get for that person is going to include their true level of anxiety plus some degree of error. In an ideal world, we could measure a person's anxiety with a very reliable test, and we'd never get any other score other than their true score. But that's a perfect world, and that's not going to happen, because in psychological research and psychological measurement, there's always going to be a source of error. In personality, this is particularly true because personality variables, we assume, are trait variables, and they don't tend to change that much. But whenever you're measuring a personality characteristic, there is another source of error that contributes to the score, and that is the person's state or their mood. Okay, that has an impact, and we know mood changes quite a bit, or it can change. And so it can influence the observed score that you get for that person's personality characteristic. So just to summarize, every score or test measurement that you get when you're measuring a personality characteristic like anxiety, you're going to get your observed score. That's what their score ends up being. But you know that it is actually not their actual true score. It's their true score plus some source of error or some component of error. Now, there are different kinds of error too. There's random error and then systematic error. Random error occurs when a person's score, let's say for a personality characteristic, is influenced by maybe they're in a bad mood, or they just got off a telephone call that was distressing, or maybe they found out they just won some big prize. Those things are going to influence their mood, which probably will have an impact on the score that you get for that level of that personality characteristic. Those are sources of random error. When things influence a person's score and those influences are specific to the person being measured, then that's a source of random error. Another source of random error would be, let's say you send somebody a personality test link on the computer and they log in, but their computer continually freezes and crashes, so they have to start and restart the personality test before they finally get to the end and have an observed score. That random error of that person's computer freezing up will have an impact. Systematic error, on the other hand, is error that affects all of the people you are measuring consistently. An example of this is your personality test of anxiety. Let's say that when you give the test and you compute their scores, you've accidentally included an error in the code on the computer that totals their scores. And so their scores are going to be off because of that one question that was miscoded. That's a source of systematic error. It affects everybody that you measure. What are some ways that you can reduce that error so that you can get closer to a person's true score, or reduce that error in an experiment so that you can get a more reliable result? Here are some of the things that can reduce your reliability that you're getting either when you're measuring a personality construct or when you're conducting a study. One of the first things is low precision of measurement. This could happen, let's say, if you're running a personality study and the experimenter who's conducting the study is giving slightly different instructions to each participant. That slight difference in instructions will have the effect of introducing error into the results of the study, and that will reduce the reliability. Another thing that can reduce reliability of measurement and can affect the measure that you get is the state of the participant. If you have a participant and you're measuring some characteristic of their personality and they are in a particularly bad mood or a particularly good mood, perhaps something happened on the way to the lab, that can have an impact on their mood or their state, and it will influence their score. Because if we think back to classical test theory, the score that you get, the observed score, is a product of that person's true score plus error. And in this case, the error would be whatever event happened on the way to the lab. Maybe they almost got in a car accident on the way in and their anxiety level is a little bit high. That state of anxiety will introduce error, and it will undermine the reliability of the personality measurement you get of that person. Another thing that can reduce reliability is the experimenter. Whether your experimenter is female or male, whether they're attractive to the participant, that can have a different impact on each participant that comes in. Whether you have more than one experimenter, each experimenter might be introducing a slight little bit of error into your study or into that personality measurement, and so the observed score will be a measure of that person's true score plus the error that's associated with each different experimenter. Another thing that can impact the reliability and reduce it in studies and in measurement is the environment in which you're measuring that characteristic. Maybe the experimenter is wearing a white lab coat. That can have an impact on the state of the participant. It's possible they might see that lab coat and assume that it's more formal of a setting than they thought, and that can have an impact on their answers and their responses in that study. Maybe you've scheduled them for an experiment at 5 o'clock on Friday and they just want to get in and get out, and being in the lab is the last place they want to be on a Friday. That's going to be something that can reduce or impact the reliability of your measurement. What are some things we can do to increase the reliability, reduce that error? Well, one of the first things you can do when you're running a study is be really careful and write a script or a protocol and make sure that each of your experimenters follows that protocol exactly. That way you'll reduce any sort of error associated with different experimenters, with slightly different wording, and so on. Another thing, and this sounds kind of weird, but it's true, If you want to increase reliability in your measurement, then ask about something important. If you ask about something boring and trivial, it's not likely that your participant's going to spend much energy thinking about their answer to that question. But if you ask them something more personal to them, more relevant to them, say something controversial or political, if they tend to be a political person, then they're going to think about it more carefully, and the answer that you get is going to be a more reliable answer. And then finally, one of the most important things you can do in personality research is to do something called aggregation. Aggregation occurs when you measure the same characteristic either by using multiple measures of that characteristic. For example, if you're measuring anxiety, you might have a paper and pencil test of anxiety. For example, if you're measuring anxiety, you might have a computer-administered questionnaire of anxiety. You might also have some behavioral observations of anxiety. And then perhaps you have a physiological measurement, a skin conductance measurement that will measure levels of anxiety. And then maybe you have an additional validated measure of anxiety that you can combine with your first anxiety test. When you combine all of those results together, all of those measures of anxiety together, you're going to get a much more accurate measure of that person, because any error that's associated with any one of those ways of measuring anxiety will be canceled out. Another way that you can do aggregation in personality research is to measure the same characteristic on multiple occasions. So if you wanted to get a good idea of somebody's level of anxiety, you might decide you're going to give them a test of anxiety once a week for 3 weeks, and then you take those 3 measurements and you can average them together to get a more accurate measurement. You're always going to have a more reliable measurement when you combine multiple measures instead of just relying on a single measurement of that characteristic, particularly in personality, because we know that the state or the mood of the participant is something that contributes to or adds to their true score to get your observed score for any personality characteristic you're interested in measuring. We'll talk about aggregation quite a bit because it is something that greatly reduces error and increases reliability in personality measurement. And the reason why it does that is because it allows random influences, random sources of error across different measurements, either measurements that you take over different times for a particular person, or different measurements of the same construct for the same person at one time. It allows any error associated with any of those measurements to cancel out. When you want to predict behavior, and this is particularly what personality psychologists are often asked to do, and also those who do profiling, you'll be asked to predict a person's behavior so that you will be able to make a prediction as to potentially when they're going to commit their next crime. What you need to make sure you do is you have multiple measures of that person's personality and behavior so that you can increase your ability to predict their future behavior. The next thing to talk about is the validity of the measures that we use in personality. And validity is really referring to the degree to which that measurement that you're using, let's say an anxiety test, actually is measuring anxiety and not something else like frustration or fear. So validity is the degree to which your measure is really measuring the construct that you want it to measure. Now, as far as the relationship between reliability and validity, you cannot have a valid measure of a construct unless it's reliable. That is a given. Reliability is necessary for validity. If you want to have a valid measure of anxiety, that measure also has to be reliable. However, it doesn't work the other way around. Just because you have a reliable measure doesn't mean that it is a valid measure, because you can have a measure that reliably gives you an inaccurate measure of a construct time after time after time. But because it's giving you the wrong measure of the construct, it's not really accurately measuring the construct that you're interested in. For example, let's say you have a scale, a weight scale, and when you step on that weight scale, it shows that you are 5 pounds over what you really weigh. Let's say you went to the doctor's office and you weighed yourself, and then you came home and you noticed when you got on the scale that you were 5 pounds higher than on the scale at the doctor's office. Assuming your weight doesn't change, it's going to measure the same measurement, 5 pounds over. So it's a reliable scale because you're getting that same inaccurate result time after time, but it's not really truly measuring your weight. It's not a valid measure of your weight because it is 5 pounds off. So reliability has to be there if you have a valid measure. You can't have a valid measure that's not reliable, but just because you have a reliable measure does not mean it's a valid measure. So reliability is a necessary but not sufficient cause of validity. So reliability of a measurement instrument like a personality test is necessary for that test to be valid, but just because it's reliable does not mean it's a valid test. Let's briefly talk about some different types of validity. There are many types of validity, but there's only 2 in general that we're going to talk about for this course, and one of them is face validity. Face validity is simply whether or not a personality measure looks like it's measuring what it's supposed to measure. So if you have a questionnaire and the questions are, sometimes I feel shaky and anxious, that could be one item. Another item could be, I often worry about things that could happen to my family. Another item might be, sometimes I get really keyed up when I'm concerned that something bad might happen. Thinking about the content of those 3 items, they seem to be measuring some aspect of anxiousness or worry or anxiety. So if those were 3 items on a questionnaire and I asked you, is this a face valid questionnaire of anxiety? Then all you'd have to do is read the items to know, yeah, it looks like it's measuring anxiety. So that questionnaire is very high in face validity. The other type of validity that we'll talk about in this class is construct validity, and that refers to whether a measure of any type of data, whether it's behavioral, life outcome, informant report, or self-report, is actually measuring the construct it's supposed to measure. Going into construct validity in a little more detail, this is something that was developed by Cronbach and Meehl back in the middle of last century. And it was developed because at that point in time, there were quite a few personality tests that were being developed using the empirical method for developing personality tests, which we'll talk about in the next chapter. And the weird thing about using that method for developing a personality test is that sometimes the items on the test aren't face valid. And it has to do with the way that the test is developed. And more about that in the next chapter. But Cronbach and Meehl became concerned that you have these personality tests. How do you know that they're really measuring what you think they're measuring? If you really want to have a good measure of anxiety and you develop a test and you think it measures anxiety, how do you know whether it truly measures anxiety? They developed this idea of construct validity. If you have a test that measures anxiety, to the extent that it actually measures the construct of anxiety, then you have a construct valid test. So how do you determine construct validity of any given test? Well, you have to test the assumptions of your construct. So if we think about anxiety as a construct, it involves some degree of worry. It involves some degree usually of some sort of behavioral activation where you have the increase in heart rate or increase in breathing, feeling maybe butterflies sometimes, feeling on edge. It also involves some degree of worrying not only about yourself but about other people. All of those things are part of this construct that we consider to be anxiety. We don't tend to think that anger is a part of anxiety or enthusiasm is a part of the construct of anxiety. So if your measurement of anxiety includes measures of any of those other things, anger, enthusiasm, for example, then you don't really have a construct valid measure. So how do you know whether you have a valid measure? Well, you compare your measure of your construct, in this case anxiety, to a whole bunch of other measures, and you want to include measures that are measuring the same construct. So the same construct would be other measures that are measuring anxiety, but you also want to include other measures that aren't measuring anxiety, because your goal is to show that your measurement is measuring anxiety, but it's not measuring anything else. So you gather a lot of those tests, other measures of anxiety that are validated, and you administer them or you give them out to people at the same time as you give out your measure of anxiety. You give it out to as many people as you can, and then you look at the patterns of correlations between the different measures. So for your anxiety construct, you've developed your questionnaire for anxiety, and you have found another very well validated measure of anxiety, and you're going to give that out at the same time, because what you want to show is that your measure of anxiety and that measure of anxiety are highly correlated. You would expect that your test of anxiety would correlate highly with the other well-validated test of anxiety. Now, I mentioned that you're going to include measures of constructs that you assume to be unrelated to anxiety, such as enthusiasm and anger. You also want to correlate those with your measure of anxiety, because what you'd like to show is that while your anxiety measure correlates highly with the other measures of anxiety, and that's what you would expect, you also want to show that your anxiety measure does not correlate with things like enthusiasm or anger or any other construct that you can think of that theoretically should not be related to yours. What you would eventually want to show is that the correlations between other validated measures of anxiety and your measure of anxiety are very strong, and correlations between measures like enthusiasm and anger and any other construct that you can think of that should not be correlated with your measure aren't correlated. So you want to see the pattern of correlations to show that your measure is measuring only anxiety and not these other things. That is how you show that you have a very construct valid measure. The goal is to show that it measures the construct that you are interested in and nothing else. The last issue to be concerned about when we're measuring personality characteristics and doing personality research is generalizability. And really that's just the degree to which a personality measurement or a result of a personality test applies to other situations or other settings or other people. When we're talking about participants, this has been an issue in the past because for many years, only men were used in research studies. And then after that, the majority of participants were also men. But more recently, more women are likely to volunteer and show up for personality studies. And we can't necessarily assume that men and women will respond the same way. And in fact, they don't often, to different treatments, and that men and women have similar levels of different personality characteristics. Another issue to be concerned about with generalizability is the people that you are able to include in your research. There seems to be a type of person that tends to sign up for research experiments and then actually show up for the research experiments. And some limited research has shown that people who sign up and show up for a research study are different in personality characteristics than people who sign up and then fail to show up. So you may be getting this weird subset of participants that have specific personality characteristics just because they're the ones that volunteered for your study. There's other research that suggests that most of our psychological research and findings are based on college students from Western universities. They have developed a funny sort of acronym to describe them. Most of the people that are involved in psychological experiments we would call weird. So they're from Western countries. They're well educated. Those countries are industrialized, and because of that, they tend to be rich or very wealthy. And those countries tend to be democratic too. So because our psychological research is based on that subset of people in the world that fit that weird acronym, we might need to be concerned about our results and whether those results would generalize to non-Western cultures that are not democratic, that include people that are less wealthy and less educated, for example. Another thing to consider is something called cohort effects. Cohort effects refer to circumstances that may affect one generation or one group of people living at a particular time that may be very different from those that live in other periods of time, either earlier or later. Here's an example of that. The current generation tends to use text and messaging as one of the primary forms of communication. 30 years ago, those were not modes of communication that were very easy, and most people did not have devices that would allow that kind of communication. So, participants 30 years ago, even 20 years ago, may have communicated very differently than participants today. That's just one example of how there could be very stark differences between groups of people at different periods of time. Another thing to consider is ethnic or cultural diversity. In the United States, we're very ethnically and culturally diverse, and that's one of our strengths. And there has been a push by the APA to include greater distributions of different ethnicities and people with cultural backgrounds in research. But it hasn't always been that way. And so that really makes us question whether some of the findings in psychological research are valid and can be applied to different people of different backgrounds, different ethnicities, and different cultures. Now, this is something we're going to study specifically when we study how culture impacts personality and vice versa. So overall, generalizability refers to the degree to which a measure, a construct measure, or a research study is valid across different contexts or settings, and that could be different parts of the country, that could be in a lab setting versus a real-world setting, for different groups of people, people that are middle-aged versus children versus teenagers, people of different cultural backgrounds. Whether a result is generalizability or remains valid across different conditions. If you give a personality test on a computer, do those results generalize to giving a personality test with paper and pencil? Or in an interview setting, are the results in those different conditions going to be equally valid? And as I mentioned before, sometimes having greater generalizability is not the goal, particularly when you are looking to find differences that are related to age or culture or ethnicity, etc. What is important is to identify the contexts in which a specific measurement is and is not applicable across different groups, across different settings. What we need to do is avoid simplistic generalizations, because that's not always the goal in our research, particularly if we're studying how different ethnic backgrounds or cultures impact the personality of the people from those cultures. And indeed, in studying cultural influences on personality, it's likely that you will find many personality characteristics are not generalizable across cultures.